Introduce my friend Martha Davis, who was the executive director of the Mono Lake Committee during that incredible time of the water battle and the water board decision. And I really truly believe Martha was the right person in the right place at the right time to make the Mono Lake decision happen. She's gone on to an illustrious career with water agencies in Riverside area. And she's going to talk to us today about lessons learned in Mono Lake and how perseverance pays off.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, and obviously this is a terrific panel of speakers. But I have to say, the McClellan sisters, you take my breath away. And I think you are representative of this next generation that, and part of my theme of my talk today is just how breathtaking it is to think about the implications of climate change. So let me pick up kind of where you were at, or pick up off of your points, because I think in the bigger world of climate change, I think we talk about it in terms of polar bears and atolls in the Pacific that are getting swamped by the sea level rise. We talk about impacts in terms of 50 to 70 years. What the McClellan sisters are showing us are the impacts that are occurring right now, already occurred. And it only takes you looking at the last 5 years to really have a sobering moment about what it does mean for us just here in California without going to the broader ecological perspectives. In the last 5 years, we went through the most serious drought that we've had in our human history. We survived it, thank God. And thank goodness for the 200% plus of precipitation that we got this year. But talk about, wild swings in weather and in the precipitation. We had a year where we virtually had no snowpack at all. And during that time period, the state experienced the 5 largest forest fires in terms of acreage in its entire history of human occupation. I think the one that's the most sobering is the data point from 2014, 2015. I'm sure it corresponds with our year in which we had virtually no snow. But I wrote this down. The temperature, the average temperature for the Sierra region in 2014, 2015 was 32.1 degrees Fahrenheit. What does that tell you? It's impossible when you look at all of this information not to think about the impacts on the natural world, and I think of it in terms of the loss of the beautiful things. Kaylin talked about the glaciers that the next generation may never see and what that means. But there's so many living creatures that are part of this ecosystem. I think of it in terms of the pikas. For me, they're the iconic species. I think I was influenced by the Sierra Nevada Alliance conference I went to, and they talked about, the pikas really, their metabolism need those cooler temperatures, and they can go up to a point, but what happens when they run out of up in this temperature change? And so I watch the data for the pikas because I worry about them, but they're emblematic of all the things that are going on and the nature of the losses that inevitably we're going to have to experience. And here's where I tie it back to Mono Lake. I wasn't there in 1978, but Dave Herbst and a number of other people in this room were, standing on the shores of Mono Lake with the study in hand, knowing about the inevitable consequences of the excessive diversions of water from the Mono Lake system, and asking the question, what do we do? Do we let a place that is as magnificent as Mono Lake, a beautiful place with a lot of beautiful species, do we lose it? What can we do to save it? Is it possible to save it? And I think we're facing the same kinds of questions with climate change. Not just what we do in our personal lives to try and slow the rate of climate change, but to think strategically about what happens next as these ecosystems start to shred and the changes compound one another, what do we do as humans to try and not just slow the progress, but figure out what can survive into that future, what part of the genetic pool will make it? Mono Lake was easier as an issue, to be honest with you, than dealing with climate change. You know, our core problem was simpler. I've heard one writer, John Hart, talk about it almost like a cartoon, where we were talking about how to share water between the needs of Mono Lake and the needs of the people of Los Angeles. And the question really that Mono Lake raised was whether or not as humans and as a society, we could choose a different path, whether we could alter our behavior so that there was a little bit of room for Mono Lake and make that commitment to Mono Lake's protection. Whereas with climate change, you're talking about this, we've already pushed ecosystems in so many ways to the edge with our human existence, and so many different ways in which we've chopped up those ecosystems. And so we now have natural forces compounding the problems that those ecosystems are already experiencing. So you can think about it from the standpoint of the Endangered Species Act. We rely upon the Endangered Species Act to kick in and create refugia for these species so they don't go over the edge. But what happens when they're right at that point where you're using the Endangered Species Act and then climate change kicks in? Do we have an obligation to turn the world upside down? This is the question that comes up in the regulatory arenas. Do we have an obligation, because climate change is pushing these species over the edge, to try and save them? And there are going to be people out there who are going to say no. When I think about the lessons from Mono Lake, I think about some of the principles that guided the Mono Lake Committee's activities. It mattered how we worked to solve the problem at Mono Lake, and I think it's going to matter how we work to solve the challenges of climate change. And I picked out three that I thought were the most important, and there's so many people in the room that have been part of this campaign, maybe they'll have others that they want to add. One is to talk about shared needs, and we talked regularly that Mono Lake and the City of Los Angeles shared the same problem. They both needed an adequate and reliable water supply. So it was, from there, it was an easy step to say, how do we share the resource between the needs of the two? And we needed to fill in the blanks of what was going to create a healthy ecosystem at Mono Lake. But the rest of it was really not mechanical, but more creative on how did we make sure that Los Angeles had water from other sources to meet the needs of the city at the same time they were making the decision to protect Mono Lake. Second principle was to care about the people of Mono Lake as much as we cared about the birds and the fish in the Mono Basin. And that's going to be a really important principle in climate change because of the human impacts that are occurring simultaneously with all of the natural impacts. The one that still stuns me is just from this drought. Do you realize there are families still in the Central Valley that for 3 years and counting have not had clean drinking water in their homes, who still go down to the community center in order to take showers with their kids? There's a human dimension to climate change that makes it critically important that we constantly think in terms of both the natural systems and the people that are being impacted, and in particular the people who are the poor, the people that are least capable of adapting to some of the changes. Another example is the heat island effect in urban areas. Who gets hurt the most in those circumstances? It's the poor that are in the center of the cities where there aren't many trees. Finally, in the Mono Lake case, we refused to accept a trade-off of one ecosystem for another in saving Mono Lake. At the time, we were talking about that in terms of the Delta, San Francisco Bay Delta. So we refused to accept the idea that you would sacrifice the Bay Delta as a replacement supply for Mono Lake. It was one of the reasons why we worked so hard to develop local water supplies in Los Angeles. But I think we have the same issue coming up on climate change. Refugia, and connectivity between habitats, it's going to be really critical. There are going to be people who are going to cut to the chase and say, we can save this one and we can't save that one. And while that may be true, I find the hubris of making choices like that intimidating, scary. I don't think we know enough about these ecosystems to know how those trade-offs are going to be made. In terms of the victory on Mono Lake, I find this part of it really interesting because it's been almost 25 years now. We're getting old. And a lot of people, when I talk to them about Mono Lake, it's almost like they're reading a novel. They know there's a happy ending. and so it's kind of cool to go through the, what did you do then and how about this? But from the standpoint of being in the story, it was incredibly scary. There were really bad days, bad weeks, bad months. I can remember at least one bad year. So, I feel like as we talk about these campaigns and what it means to run these campaigns, what does it mean to fight climate change? We're always in the story. We don't know what the ending is. And so this is where, I'll get to it in a second, but it's the idea that you never stop. There is no ending. There's only the trying to figure out how do you hold on to as much as good is out there that you can. And so I think there are two keys to success, and hopefully the next generations will take them to heart. One is the strategy of persistence. So this is Janet has commented on this before. A friend of mine, Felicia Marcus, who's now at the State Water Resources Control Board, describes the Mono Lake strategy as persistently applied. In other words, we never stopped. And you see that still today. If you remember with the Mono Lake victory, Mono Lake Committee celebrated, we all celebrated. But what did we receive? It was a piece of paper with a promise. The piece of paper doesn't implement the promise. We implement the promise. And that is why the story, in a way, is a never-ending story, because you have to continually make sure that the promise is fulfilled of a functioning, healthy ecosystem at Mono Lake. And that'll be true with climate change. And the other part of the key to success is how long it really takes. People focus on the 1978 through 1994 portion of the Mono Lake campaign and say, oh my God, that was a really long time. But it was there that we won. That's not when we won. We won the first day that the people in the Mono Basin, when LA came up to start planning to take the water, said no. It was the people who refused to sell their land, the people that fought the condemnation lawsuit. It was Eldon Vestal who refused to allow the state of California to get away with not diverting the water appropriately consistent with the Fish and Game Code section 5937. It was the people in the Owens Valley that fought the second barrel of the aqueduct. The Mono Lake Committee's campaign with all of you was a culmination of so many decades of people saying, no, there's got to be a different way, there's got to be a different choice. And that will be true for climate change. The work of this generation, the work of the next generation, will build on one another. And if we can find those synergies and how we work together towards a vision of working through climate change so that not only we adapt, but we save, there will be something very precious given to the future generations. So I'm going to close it here. As I was working on this, I was thinking about one of my favorite books, the trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. How many people read, seen the movie? Most of you. How many times? But you remember in the first book, when Frodo finally realizes that the ring that he has is evil, and he says, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given to us. If there is one all-encompassing lesson from the Mono Lake story, it is this. As humans, as a society, we have choice. We can choose to make changes in our lives and save a Mono Lake. We can choose to protect areas as genetic refugia. We can choose to make room for connectivity for habitats that'll make all the difference to species as they go through their struggles in dealing with climate change. It is a matter of choice, not just to slow the impacts of the climate change, but to be a part of making the choice of what we can do to save so many beautiful things for the sake of the planet. Thank you.